when you're training people who are already climate activists, this idea that, it's a good conversation if you both change your minds. People can go, well, I'm not going to change my mind about climate change. It's a massive deal to me. And then we have to say, no, but it might involve you revisiting some of your assumptions about the other person.
This is not a conversation. You are not conversing with me. You are sitting there and you are listening. Quite right too. This is Your Brain on Climate. That's how it works. But look, most of the time, that isn't what communication is. We often think climate communication, talking to people about climate change, is about one person saying something and through the power of rhetoric and persuasion and moral force, persuading the other person to act. That ain't how conversations work. That's not, if you think about good conversations that you've had, they've not been someone banging you over the head with facts and you meekly submit. They've been trusting and learning stuff and reflecting on what you think. And this is most of the way that each of us form our opinions about the world and what's in it, I think. So in this episode of Your Brain on Climate, we're going to talk about the humble conversation you having a natter with somebody else and whether that might be the most underrated thing we can all do to change the planet. I'm going to be talking to Alex Evans. Alex is the founder and director of an organisation called Larger Us that exists for exactly this sort of thing. How do we build trust in each other? How do we bring people closer together and do something about the fact that more and more these days, if you go online, you'll find people screaming at each other. You can see it happening in our society, in our politics at the big level. You can see climate change becoming increasingly about people worried it's a threat to their way of life and other people getting more and more upset about it. We're screaming at each other more and more. It's harder and harder to find a nice common ground where we can actually chat and think. So Larger Us are about doing that. And we're talking about conversations, the power of the conversation, learning from the work that Alex has been doing to help millions of people have climate conversations, but also other things like deep canvassing, this brilliant thing that's been happening in the States and elsewhere, where simply through the art of one person who thinks something, talking to someone else who thinks something else in the right way, people can come to realise that what they immediately thought, what they first thought, that first knee-jerk reaction that we all have, that thing where we think, I think X, and we don't think any more about it, that actually that may not be what we think. That probably we might have a lot more common ground than we reckon. And if you get the conversation right, you can get a lot of that thinking right too. As always, if you hear this noise, it denotes wisdom. It means somebody, Alex, pretty much entirely in this episode, has said something of interest that you might want to go back and refer to later. You can have a look in the show notes and I've put a little link in the right place. Thank you so much to everyone who sponsors me, helps keep this show on the road. I pay my guests. It means a lot to me. People are giving up their time and their wisdom and their expertise, and I'm bringing it to you, and I think they should be paid for that. So if you want to help, if you've enjoyed this or any of the other episodes, you can chuck in at patreon.com/yourbrainonclimate. Do please leave me a review on your podcast medium of choice. 5-star and a written review means so much to a small independent podcast. It really, really does. You'd be doing me a massive favour. And do drop me an email to hello@yourbrainonclimate.com with any thoughts on the show.
Breathe on climate.
Do you find it easy talking to people about climate change?
Great question. No, often not. I find when it's me in real life that I'm often a little bit shy of raising climate change for one of a range of reasons. One is that I worry that people will think I'm being preachy or self-righteous. Another is that I fret that maybe I'll get called out as a hypocrite because I live a less than environmentally perfect life. Sometimes.
Oh yeah, all right. Oh yeah. How's this podcast being recorded then? I suppose you're just doing that on wood, are you? Hey?
Yeah, they might have seen me, kind of eating meat or something. And then, of course, there's just the fear that maybe you're not expert enough. I don't have a degree in atmospheric physics. Is this going to trip me up? And the thing is that in the work that we do at Larger Us on training people to have great climate conversations, these are exactly the barriers that we hear over and over again from people about why they hesitate to talk about climate change. And one of the things that really captivated us and persuaded us to do this work to begin with was the finding from Britain Talks Climate, which you're obviously very familiar with, that 55% of us in the UK talk about climate change infrequently, rarely, or never. Very arresting statistic. The first time we saw that, we thought that is astonishing, given what a massive, urgent issue it is. But then as soon as you stop to think about it, it becomes not so astonishing because all of us feel these real world barriers to talking about it.
I mean, look, I've worked on climate for 20 years, give or take, climate-y stuff. It is pretty bloody rare that I go down the pub with my mates and talk to them about climate change. And if I don't do it, what hope has anyone else got?
Yeah. So, and yet we know there's so much evidence to show that when we talk about it, that is impactful in all sorts of different ways. I mean, we've come across this evidence that, doorstep conversations are one of the most effective things a political campaign can do at election time. So we know it's a factor in how people vote. And then, of course, there's all the ways that conversations shape our values, our attitudes and beliefs. One of the statistics we always talk about in the training is about the amazingly fast and deep shift in attitudes that was obviously seen around equal marriage over the last 20 years. I mean, I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think if you go back to the kind of mid-80s, support for same-sex marriage was kind of, in the 20s or 30s. But by the time you get up to the kind of late 2010s, it's over 70%. I mean, that's a really profound, but also incredibly fast shift in social attitudes. And the evidence is that the single biggest thing that changed people's minds on that issue was knowing somebody who was gay and having conversations with them. So it's not just kind of, voting behavior and those sort of everyday political actions. It's also really profound social attitudes are very much shaped by what we talk about and who we talk about it with.
Why?
Well, I think because we're social animals. I mean, I've always been obsessed with the sociology of how social tipping points happen. And as you will know, there's a kind of lively debate about, well, what proportion of a given population do you need to reach a social tipping point? And lots of people talk about 25% as the magic number. That's sometimes a bit contested. But I think the thing that is clear is that there is such a thing as social contagion. I mean, we're all very familiar with it in innocuous little everyday settings. Like if someone near you starts yawning, you are very likely to start yawning as well. Or you certainly will have experienced that lovely thing where giggling becomes infectious in a room, especially if you're not really supposed to be laughing and, everyone's corpsing. And that's social contagion. But of course, social contagion can happen on attitudes as well. We're social creatures. I mean, to take another example, how values shifted around drink driving. I mean, we're probably about the same age as each other. I remember when I was a kid, it was regarded as completely normal to be, hammered and then drive home. My mother-in-law is a retired doctor, and she's got stories about how surgeons would think nothing of sinking a couple of pints at lunchtime before going and doing an afternoon of procedures in the operating theatre. Clearly, all of that is unthinkable now.
Drinking and driving are dangerous. 4 single whiskies and the risk of accident can be twice as great. 6 singles and the risk can be 6 times as great. 8 and the risk can be 25 times as great.
And that is just because, in the same way that we see memes and things going viral on the internet, values and opinions and all the rest of it go viral in slower time through social interaction, through our conversations.
So I want to dig into this a little bit. You've said some amazing stuff already, and I want to pick up the stuff about the things we worry about climate change, maybe as we go on a bit. But let's ask you what seems like, I suppose, a stupid question, but maybe it isn't. When you say conversation, what is it and what isn't it?
I mean, I guess it's a really interesting one. We've gone back and forth on what is a climate conversation. Does it have to have climate as the sort of overt subject of the conversation? Maybe it doesn't use the word climate. And I think, that there's clearly one of the things that's so interesting about conversations is that there's so many different levels of depth to them. There's the kind of, just quick exchange of hellos with the person you may live next door to but not know the name of. There's life-changing, utterly profound conversations where, I don't know, your opinion about something shifts 180 degrees. And then there's all the ones in the middle. the sort of little chats that we have with friends in the pub or with someone we know to say hello to in the queue at the post office. And I think one of the delightful things is these are all examples of conversations, even though they're all really quite different from each other. And they are clearly just a quintessential part of what it is to be human.
So is a large part of it, what it isn't, is me and you going for a drink in which I talk for 95% of the time about things I think, and you go, yeah, all right, fine, that all sounds good. There's an element of to and fro about it. Is that important?
Yeah, very much so. And I think, if we're talking about now what is a good conversation, one of the things we touch on in the training that we do is that, a conversation that's gone really well is one where maybe both sides have changed their minds a little bit about the other or learned something new about the other. And it's an interesting one because, when you're training people who are already climate activists, this idea that, it's a good conversation if you both change your minds. People can go, well, I'm not going to change my mind about climate change. It's a massive deal to me. And then we have to say, no. It doesn't necessarily involve suddenly you becoming a climate skeptic, but it might involve you revisiting some of your assumptions about the other person. And I think that, when we've, we'll talk more about this, I'm sure, but there's a guy in the States who we've got to know over the last few years, Dave Fleischer, who's one of the originators of deep canvassing, this fascinating kind of approach to campaigning where you're having conversations across lines of difference with people who are likely to disagree with you. And Dave, talks about deep canvassing in this very interesting way that what's happening when the person doing the canvassing is showing the respect, asking the open-ended questions, really doing the active listening. That kind of, even before you get to the hot button issues, there's a sense where because each side is willing to kind of, start from an open perspective rather than beholden to kind of their starting assumptions, that's what creates the possibility of common ground, that you're creating space where the person you're talking to may change their own mind. And it's quite a different thing from you changing their mind because you've flattened them with loads of arguments or evidence or whatever it might be. It's kind of that Dave, I think I'm fair in saying, would argue that people only ever change their own minds.
Let me see if I've got what you just said right. We often think that the art of a persuasive conversation is where we go to have a pint with someone and we come out of it with them having bought our argument, right? We have in some way won. And I guess one of the things that's hard about that is it's often really hard to win on something that people feel very strongly about. What you're saying and what Dave over in the States says is, no, it's different to that. People will make their own mind up if you give them the right sort of time and space for them to think about what it is they actually think in the first place, right? Talk to me more about that, because it feels really profound and important.
Well, I think one of the things that fascinated us when we dug into the research and the evidence around this whole area is the idea that even just creating a space in which people can have a chance to think about climate change in a non-pressured way can in itself be really quite impactful. Because again, if you're, like you or me, we've worked on climate change for years, we feel deeply passionate about it. Of course, we take it as a given. Of course, it's top of mind for us. And I find it easy to forget there's lots of people who, they're not outright climate skeptics or deniers, but it's just not top of mind for them in the way that it might be for me. There are people that, in opinion polls will probably show up as favouring climate action. If a pollster from YouGov phones up and says, do you think this is a priority? They'll say yes. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's top of their list of priorities. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to come out on top. If you get into trade-offs of like, well, if you had to choose action on this issue or this issue, if you had to choose £10 billion of public spending on this or the health service, what's your top priority? So that's, here we're talking about the people that are often called persuadables, which is a term that we don't really like at Larger Us. We much prefer the term engageables because it sounds a bit more like a two-way street of conversation rather than a one-way street. But this is the majority of people in society. 69% of people in the UK are so-called persuadables, whereas only 13% of us in the old edition of Britain Talks Climate were so-called progressive activists. That's actually just fallen to 8% in the edition that came out a week or two ago. So, what we take away from that is there aren't enough of us who self-identify as activists to achieve the breakthroughs that we need to see or reach one of those social tipping points that we talked about earlier. It's absolutely imperative that we find ways to engage with that 69% of people, because as our friend George Marshall, who of course is the founder of Climate Outreach, observes in his great book, the thing about climate change is it's just too big an issue to be solved with anything less than what he calls a near total commitment across society. So really, that's one of the things that led us to want to get into climate conversations, this feeling that there's a whole lot of people among that cohort of persuadables who have not been heard on climate change. They may very often have felt talked at, which, as you've pointed out, is a very different experience, a very different dynamic. But actually just feeling heard and having that time and space to think, well, what do I think about this issue? Which bits of it do matter most for me? What do I think should be done about this? That in itself is impactful. And it's also helpful for the activist or the sort of volunteer initiating the conversation, because then they feel under less pressure. One of the other things we hear a lot in the training is that if people go into these conversations feeling like this one interaction has to be a kind of Damascene conversion, and if I don't get this person coming out the other side of the conversation a fully paid up member of Just Stop Oil, then I've somehow fallen short. That's a terrible amount of pressure to put ourselves under. And if we do feel that pressure, we're much more likely to show up in the ways that we know we probably shouldn't, kind of hectoring or preachy or all of that. So again, that just, listening in a non-judgmental way and showing genuine curiosity can be much more transformative than we necessarily think at first glance.
So I like this thing about people thinking in their own pace without threat, I guess, is a large part of what you're saying, right? That they kind of are, the person we are engaging with is able just to think about what they think about something. And a large part of our job then is to not come across as a dick, right? It's kind of what I'm hearing, so that happens. But what if, like, how do people who want to get radical climate action deal with the fact that for a lot of people, what they think should happen might not be smash capitalism and immediately end all polluting stuff? It might just be, look, I'd quite like to be able to cycle more, but I'd like to keep my car and I don't want to change my gas boiler. How do we deal with the fact that actually, how do we, and I guess that's what I'm asking, how do we as the people on the other end of that conversation deal with the fact that most people are not as radical as us, even when they've thought about it?
Yeah. It's such a good question. And I think that one of the things I've been reflecting on a lot through the experience of doing this is thinking that as a movement, we've got a lot of work to do to develop a kind of more diverse range of what I think of as ladders of engagement. That, very often the so-called asks, in inverted commas, that campaigners hit people with, things like sign this petition, give us 10 quid a month, come to this meeting and organize with us. These are the sort of actions that appeal to people who are already progressive activists. If you're in one of the other segments that show up in the Britain Talks climate report, like an established liberal or a loyal national, things like signing a petition, even writing to your MP may not be sort of as normal. They may seem like quite high bar actions, things that you don't necessarily imagine, quotes, people like me doing. And I think that, so for example, you touched on there a couple of examples of personal actions that people might take if they get fired up about climate change, like recycling more or eating a bit less meat or whatever it might be. And I think, again, those of us in the movement can be a bit dismissive of that because we are rightly interested in systemic change. And sometimes, wrongly, I would argue, we look at those personal actions and think, well, that's just completely beside the point. What we really need to see is like big picture transformation. That's about government policy. So we need to get out there and kind of, have huge strategic narratives or massive policy asks. And it really doesn't matter if Ethel at number 47 is recycling or not. I think that's kind of blinkered because, for one thing, those little personal actions might be the first steps on a different ladder of engagement that might take them also somewhere really impactful, but perhaps a different kind of activism or active citizenship, if we want to call it that, to the sort that we're used to. I think there's also a more subtle thing here, which we've thought about a lot with this training, about should climate conversations end up with an ask at all? Now, lots of people in campaigning groups naturally want to have a clear ask because, you know, it generates a sense of impact for the activists or the volunteers initiating the conversation. You can tot up those actions taken and use them to show to, for example, funders and say, here is proof of the impact of this project that you've funded. The hesitation we've got about that is that when you kind of conclude the conversation with the action on a plate, like now please sign this petition or, you know, get involved in this group, we're treating people a bit like pawns in somebody else's chess game. And so it also sort of undermines the idea of this having been a genuine conversation. You can see how it would be easy for the person on the receiving end of that to think, this wasn't really a genuine exchange of views. This was more like this activist has made a big show of nodding along empathetically while I talked, and now is hitting me with what was always, from their point of view, the objective of the conversation. And that's not wrong. That's not an inaccurate interpretation of what's just happened. And the thing is that people do tune out of a lot of kind of, you know, things in the political realm because they feel like they don't have agency, like their agency is not being respected. And so I think where you have something that is much more of a genuine exchange of views, where also both people are holding the question, well, what could we and should we do about this? That's a whole different dynamic where you're initiating a conversation with someone and you're treating them as a grown-up, someone with their own ideas and their own power, importantly, to bring to the party. So obviously that's more empowering. And I think that just leads to potentially a much more generative space. But there is a bit of a leap of faith involved here that is going to lead to somewhere politically impactful, given time to play out and so on.
You're brave on climate.
We will make America strong again. We will make America proud again. We will make America safe again. And we will make America great again.
So it sounds like everything we've talked about so far, when you are talking about how to have good conversations and how they've gone well, is kind of getting at something much more profound than simply a conversation about like our society and our democracy and kind of some of the stuff that feels wrong in it, that feels, if not broken, then in trouble, about polarization and people not trusting each other, not knowing each other. I'm reading Rory Stewart's political book at the moment, and he talks about people living, he opens every single door when he goes door knocking, and he finds people living separately to the people around them, this sort of separateness and this judging. And we saw it a bit, you know, obviously after the Brexit vote, when suddenly loads of people woke up and felt as if they didn't know half the people in their country, and this big dividing line happened. And so a lot of what you've been talking about feels like it's getting to this deeper stuff about maybe where we're going wrong in society in general.
Well, I think certainly, as you put your finger on there, connection is a massive aspect of all of this. I think we're all used to the idea that we're living through an epidemic of loneliness, one that came into especially sharp relief during COVID, needless to say. And also that it's become much less common than it used to be for us to meet a genuine cross-section of our peers. Sociologists talk about this huge trend called the big sort, which is the idea that over recent decades we've become more likely than ever to kind of live near, befriend, work with, study with, date, marry people with very similar backgrounds and outlooks to our own. And then, of course, since social media has come on the scene, the online version of that dynamic has become turbocharged as well. So we have the whole phenomenon of online echo chambers. Social media is very good at clustering us with people who will kind of either antagonize us, so we get sort of put face to face with people we diametrically disagree with, but also people in our own in-group. And then we can all sort of feel great together, hating on the people at the other end of the political spectrum. Social media really amplifies these dynamics. But I think that beneath all of that, lots and lots and lots of us are looking for connection. It's really, really important. And one of the things that, I find kind of heartbreaking is how often extremist groups of one stripe or another succeed because they're very effective at preying on that need for connection and belonging. I mean, if you look at white supremacist groups like the Proud Boys or the EDL, or Islamist groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir, these are groups that very much offer lots and lots of belonging. If you start to get involved on the fringes, you'll be welcomed into a kind of warm embrace. You will feel seen and affirmed.
Religious cults is another one, right? Like that's kind of the whole operating model of a cult.
Absolutely. And that clearly, is a very warped form of belonging, one that's based as much on who is excluded as who is welcomed in. But I think that, genuine, inclusive belonging is something that actually we could be so much better at in the campaigns and change-making world. I mean, I think that, there's kind of tantalizing little examples out there of what it can look like when campaigns get this right. One of my favorites is the Obama campaign in 2008, which was very much built out of a network of largely self-organized small groups where people didn't just believe in the campaign, although they certainly did, but they believed in each other and they loved getting to know each other in these small kind of very nurturing groups doing this kind of very intense real-time work together. And I think one of the tragedies is that, you had this vibrant network and then the Obama administration did nothing with it. Once it came into power, it was just allowed to kind of wither on the vine. And I think that, contributed to all sorts of political cynicism. But again, Extinction Rebellion in its heyday was very, very good at cultivating that kind of set of relationships and feeling of belonging through its network of affinity groups. Friends of the Earth right now with its climate action groups, again, very, very good at that. But so often you see campaigns that miss this trick, that do fall into the trap of just asking people, take this action, give us this money. That they could be building both more effective campaigns and also campaigns that are more rewarding for the people involved in them. So we're crazy to miss that trick.
And what is important about belonging, like for each of us? What do you think that the absence of it is leading to in our society?
Well, I think, its absence is leading to all sorts of problems, both politically, like some of the things we've touched on. Loneliness is a way into extremism. Obviously, not to say that all lonely people will fall into extremism, but most people in extremism are lonely people. And you see the same thing when you see mass shooter events in the United States or incel culture. It's all very much about loneliness. But also, there's lots of rich literature to talk about how loneliness is the kind of soil from which authoritarianism and even fascism springs. If you look at the writing of Hannah Arendt after World War II, she talks about how totalitarian regimes really try deliberately to separate people from each other, that actually those kind of networks are the thing that defuses that risk of authoritarianism. But then, of course, the other big set of costs are the mental health ones. And, there's that often cited, slightly questionable statistic that being chronically lonely is as bad for your health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. That seems like a slightly spurious level of specificity and accuracy. But nevertheless, it's clear that both for mental health and indeed for physical health, chronic loneliness is really, really bad for you. But the flip side, the more kind of positive aspect is that, when we feel belonging, like we're seen and valued and affirmed, we kind of flower as individuals. It's so central to human flourishing. And I really find fascinating the idea that sociologists call primary groups, which is sort of, where you have small groups of people like a family or a team or a platoon in an army, a small number of close relationships where everybody knows everybody else pretty well. There's something about that size of group that just coheres. There's a reason armies, since time immemorial, have organized themselves into platoon-sized units. And I think it's really interesting when you see campaigns or lots of other kinds of groups like, house churches in a religious kind of context that capitalize on just how powerful and how unlocking those kind of small groups can be.
And I suppose the other thing as well as belonging that's underpinning all of this is trust, or the absence of it. Do you see a problem with trust in our society at the moment?
Well, clearly there's all sorts of problems with trust in our political system, and trust of the media and trust of big corporations and all of that. But if you get into kind of the trust that we do or don't have for each other, that I think is the most interesting one in all of this, because, it's impossible to talk about social cohesion or about political polarization, which you touched on earlier, without looking at this idea of trust. And I think that mistrust, the kind of ascribing of stupidity or malign motives onto the out group, really flourishes in conditions of low connection, of low kind of relational bandwidth. And one of the things that's really interesting in the research, there's a guy called Bobby Duffy at the Policy Institute at King's College London, who wrote this great report 2 or 3 years ago called Divided Britain. And it's really interesting on how actually we're much less divided than we think we are on the issues. There's actually a very high degree of consensus on a surprising number of political issues. But where you do see genuine polarization is what he calls effective polarization, which is to say polarization that isn't because we disagree on the issues, it's just because we don't like or trust each other. And of course, you want to see how that looks when it gets really out of control. Look at the United States, where there's any number of polls where you ask Democrats or Republicans what they think of each other, and then you sort of find out the real answers, and they think they're far farther apart than they are in reality. And that is because of exactly this issue of mistrust that you're talking about. And you also, I think, put your finger on another really important aspect of this earlier, which is the feeling of threat perception that's so often there in politics at the moment, especially in conditions of effective polarization, where both sides think our society's whole way of life is at stake and it's at risk because of them, because of that group over there. And then you start displaying contempt towards that group, and nothing fires people up like feeling like they're on the receiving end of contempt. And then you get into one of these mutual radicalization dynamics, as sociologists call them, and then you're really going nowhere good. So I think the more that we are creating that relational bandwidth, especially across political tribes, so that we're kind of defying that logic of the big sort of the online echo chambers, that is the thing that can help us to defuse polarization and so-called culture wars and them and us dynamics before they really set in. If you kind of know people who are different from you and you've had the chance to chat, it's just this wonderful kind of safety net for all of us that makes it that a lot harder for assumptions about each other to get out of control and completely lose touch with reality.
And just before we move off this, I do think there is something happening in the politics of climate change in the UK now that feels a bit like that worrying dynamic you were talking about, of there, a sense is being, I think, deliberately stoked that there are some people, there are some fuzzy elite screen people who want to take away your quality of life. They are a threat to you. And into that gets lumped a load of stuff that isn't really about a threat to way of life, about like how you heat your home and, whether you drive an electric car or not. But do you agree that's happening in the climate debate? What's your take on the state of polarization?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think it's happened, but I think it's at risk of happening. I mean, I think there's kind of weak signals out there of it. So the ones I would think of, I think we've all seen how low traffic neighborhoods in some places have become amazingly toxic politically. Not necessarily because, everybody in the community has been polarized at all, but because you've got kind of highly engaged and energized political bases at opposite ends of the political spectrum. And then you can get people in the middle kind of just tuning out in exhaustion because it's all so kind of toxic and ugly. But certainly, you know, those dynamics are very, very difficult once they blow up and can really be corrosive, certainly to that near total commitment across society that George Marshall talks about as what we need to be aiming for. Then, of course, there was the whole thing about the ULEZ in London, the ultra low emission zone, which I think, you know, the sort of people who opposed climate action were very effective at sort of hanging that around Labour's neck after the Uxbridge by-election. And you can draw a very direct dotted line from that to Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves' decision to step back from their 28 billion a year spending target on climate, which shows that, you know, even if there isn't really a culture war yet, and even if, you know, really quite small numbers of people are engaged in trying to sort of create this polarization, it can create this deep sense of unease and sort of not wanting to get entangled in that can lead politicians to really dial down the political ambition. And then the other example where I think we've seen this is obviously Cumbria's coal mine, where, you know, that's become very contested. But in the wider environmental space, you can certainly see other aspects of sustainability that are, you know, at risk of polarization. I mean, I think of rewilding as one of those. I live in North Yorkshire, surrounded by kind of upland hill farms. I think sometimes farmers find talk of rewilding, you know, kind of quite, they perceive it as quite contemptuous towards them. They feel it doesn't respect a way of life that they and their families have observed for, you know, a very long time. And that feels like a kind of entirely avoidable form of polarization. And it's great to see some kind of campaigning groups like, I mean, I think of WWF, for example, has been really making an effort to create conversational bandwidth. And then, of course, there's my favorite campaign of all time, which is when Friends of the Earth Scotland and Greenpeace and Platform wanted to do a campaign on North Sea oil and gas, and did something really interesting and surprising, which was to build relationships with offshore oil workers. It really took time to build, you know, exactly as we were just talking about, to build that trust that this wasn't going to be some extractive gimmick. But the result of that has been all sorts of joint campaigns between oil workers and environmental groups, because they were able to uncover a surprising amount of stuff that they agreed on. And you know, the campaign obviously becomes so much more impactful for being made up of such surprising, unusual bedfellows. So I think, you know, it does take time to do that relational building and to create that trust and so forth. But, you know, sometimes the results can be pretty astonishing.
So what are some principles that each of us can remember next time we go and have a conversation with someone who we think, or indeed does not agree with us from the off? How do we put this into practice? And I dare say this isn't, you know, this requires work, but how do we do it?
It does require work, in the sense that over time we get better and better at it. One of the metaphors we use is that, you know, conversations are like roast dinners rather than microwave meals. You know, a good conversation takes time, and a good conversation probably takes place over a number of occasions. It doesn't all have to happen in one interaction. But I think, I mean, the 5 principles we talk about in our training for how to craft a skillful conversation. The first one is to keep it about them. You know, people love talking about themselves. And also the more that we have a sense of what they love, what they care about, the more we can kind of talk to that in speaking about climate change, rather than just hitting them over the head with like, this is a massive issue and you ought to care about it. So that's the first thing, keep it about them. Keeping it local is really helpful. It just makes it that much more specific to people's actual lives. You remember the old Fatboy Slim song, Right Here, Right Now? That's our kind of, you know, that's it. We have the cover of that single as one of the slides in the talk for this. Third thing is keep it human. And that's really about avoiding the jargon, the acronyms, so many acronyms. Just trying to avoid the alphabet soup. And just keep it relatable. The fourth one is all about keeping it curious. And that's really where we're borrowing a lot from deep canvassing, this idea of particularly asking open-ended questions. So not the yes-no questions, but what do you think about X? What have you read or heard about this? What do you think should happen? Very generative questions. And again, people love talking about themselves. And then the last one is really about keeping it positive. Creating a sense not of this being this kind of overwhelming ogre of an issue that's just going to overpower us, but rather that, it can be done. And we, including the person that you're talking to, are all needed to make it happen. And that's an interesting one, because certainly talking to people, I used to be involved in Extinction Rebellion myself. Lots of people in XR place huge emphasis on, we need to sound the alarm. People haven't heard how serious this is, so we need to sound the alarm louder. And our suggestion is a little bit, we think kind of maybe people have heard the alarm, but because they don't think there's anything they can do about it, and it's just overwhelming and depressing, you kind of put earplugs in and try and tune the alarm out, because otherwise it's just stressful. And also, we want to avoid taking people into that fight, flight, freeze mental state, because in fight, flight, freeze, you're locked into your individual interest, not the kind of common good. And it's much harder to tell the difference between what's real and what's illusory or hypothetical. It's just we're in a less useful headspace. And in the same way, guilt trips, blame game, also not helpful at all. Borrowing from the Frameworks Institute's work, what we have a sort of quote slide where we talk about how the messages that really cut through on climate are positive, hopeful, yet urgent. Those three things. And it's not hopeful in that sort of empty, optimistic, it'll probably be all right. Probably technological gadgets will save us. We really, all of us are needed in order to make this happen. But it is well within reach. And the last thing we say in the kind of workshop where we do the bulk of the training is in the second talk is that actually it's easy to forget how much amazing progress we're making on this issue. The UK is about to close its last coal-fired power station. It is entirely possible that global emissions will peak this year or next year. Britain remains, for all of the kind of backsliding in the last 2 or 3 years, remains, not far off track for its net zero target in 2030. So there is such a lot to celebrate. And I'm not making light of how much there is still to do. This year, it remains the case, global emissions are still rising. And if we've made amazing strides in the power sector, clearly there's so much still to do on transport, energy intensive industries, etc. But nevertheless, it's not the case that this is, all bad news. There is tons and tons of good news. And it's important we steer into that because, at the end of these conversations, we want both people to feel a sense of agency. Otherwise, what's the point of the conversation?
Well, no, right. And I think your point, I don't want to lose it either, about not trying to force somebody to agree with you or to do the thing that you want them to do. Feels like one of the hardest bits. Maybe if you go in with a pre-existing idea, would I be right in saying that's like a principle of having a good conversation?
Yeah. And it comes back to that question of, do you have an ask or not? And I mentioned earlier, some of the reasons we hesitate about having a concrete ask, like sign this petition, because then it's not really a real conversation. But on the other hand, you don't want it to be just a sort of conversation that goes round and then you end having kind of admired the problem together. You do want some action to emerge from it. So really, we're sort of interested in testing whether maybe the sweet spot here is neither admiring the problem nor spoon-feeding people solutions, but kind of, as I mentioned before, asking together what could and should we do as a community about this? What are the most impactful actions that we could take at home, together in our neighborhood, at constituency level, whatever it might be? But I think, that then you're creating a dynamic of active citizenship. And as we touched on before, there is a leap of faith there. It might not lead anywhere. But on the other hand, I think our existing models aren't getting us to where we need to get to. We are still too often doing activism or campaigning that plays great with the 8% of us who are progressive activists, but is not really cutting through and engaging the persuadables. So, we need to try some different stuff. But, I'll say in the next breath, what we're doing on climate conversations is experimental. We're all the time gathering data on, is this a rewarding experience for the people doing the training? Are they coming out more confident and motivated? How many conversations are they having? With whom? What's the effect on the person they're talking to? And then what's the effect politically? What does it take? how many of these conversations do you need to have to start, moving the needle politically? So there's levels and levels of data that you need to collect, and it is all an experiment. But it feels like a really interesting and worthwhile one to us.
I guess my last question is about the fear that a lot of us might have. We mentioned this right at the start, that we're going to get shouted at, or we're going to get judged, or that people are going to have a go at us for our carbon emissions. Other than don't worry about that, have you got any useful tips for how we can get that monkey off our back?
I mean, I think doing it in a group, having a little, group of you who are going to try having climate conversations together, not necessarily all going out together in the way that you'd get a little team of people who go out deep canvassing together. But, if you're making a point of checking in together, that can be really helpful. So in the training that we do with our partner organizations, after the workshop stage, which is the 2-hour kind of, skill set and mindset that you need training, people can decide to sign up for the 6-week challenge. And what happens there is that they get allocated into an 8-person group with a couple of co-hosts who are also volunteers. And over the course of 6 weeks, they meet weekly for an hour online, and they just share experiences together about how many conversations have you managed to have? How did they go? Where they went well, what do you think led them to go well? And when they were more difficult, what did you try? And that people seem to find that enormously helpful in various ways. One is that, there's some helpful mutual accountability, that if each week you're setting a target, say, well, I'm going to try and have 5 conversations this week. And if a week from now, you're going to see that same group of people, you're much more likely actually to make the effort to go and have those 5 conversations, or at least kind of 4 or maybe 3. But also, people can encourage each other and have a laugh and learn together, crucially. You're very much using that logic of primary groups that we talked about earlier, about how humans flourish in these small, tight-knit groups. And it's funny how people who in week 1, they'll say, I feel a bit shy of being in this small group. I'm not really used to this sort of thing. By week 6, they're saying, really don't want to stop. I've made really good friends here. So, again, just having a sense of kind of buddies who are on the journey with you can be hugely helpful. But I think also, that thing we touched on before about taking the pressure off of yourself can be really helpful. That, if you go into this thinking, I have to achieve a total conversion with this person, that's holding yourself to a very high and probably unrealistic standard. And if you just hold it a bit more lightly, including like some days you're not in the right headspace, you're knackered, or you're just finding climate a bit overwhelming and you're not ready to have these conversations today, totally fine. Not feeling like you have to be always on is also part of this, because as I think we've been touching on, there is emotional labor, if you like, involved in having a really good conversation and in making that effort to stay curious and be empathetic. And sometimes you're in the right headspace for that, and sometimes you're not. And it's totally fine when you're not. So I think the ability to just hold it lightly, treat each conversation as a little bit of an experiment. They're all going to go differently. There's no one-size-fits-all formula, but they're always kind of fascinating, whatever happens. Then when you're just treating it in that more experimental way, it becomes more fun and less laden with pressure.
Alex, thank you so much for coming on Your Brain on Climate. So how can people find out about these conversations and more about you and the work that you do?
They can come to our website, which is at larger.us. On the Get Involved page, there's lots more information about our Climate Conversations project. I should say that we don't run the training kind of directly to the public ourselves. We do this through a range of wonderful partner organisations that we're working with. So right now we're working with Parents for Future, the Wildlife Trusts, the Women's Institute, the Climate Coalition, Mothers Can, lots of others. We've also worked previously with Unison, the trade union, Tier Fund, all kinds of different organisations. So most people come to the training through one of those partner organisations. We do have a workshop coming up very shortly with Mothers Can, Mothers Climate Action Network. Another one, I think it's later this month, with the Climate Coalition ahead of this year's Great Big Green Week. Those are open to everybody. So if you are interested in getting involved, I will make sure that we have details of those 2 workshops on our website and a link through to where people can sign up. But we would love to see you there if you're interested.
Thanks so much, Alex. Brilliant stuff. Thank you for coming on. Alex mentioned a couple of people and organisations there that he knows I know about. I generally don't cross the streams of where I work in this podcast, but I put a few links in the show notes to the work of Climate Outreach and the Britain Talks Climate Survey that was mentioned. So do go and check this out, and obviously do check out Larger Us and Alex's work, and read more about deep canvassing, which is one of the most fascinating things I've read about for a very, very long time. A reminder again, chuck in at the patreon.com/yourbrainonclimate if you would love to chuck a couple of quid my way so I can pay guests like Alex and all the other wonderful people I've got lined up. That will be superb. And you can email me hello@yourbrainonclimate.com if you want to give me any thoughts, and the written review would be lovely. That's it. That's the usual stuff. Sorry if this episode went out a little bit later than you might have expected. A couple of scheduling issues, but all sorted now, and I hope you were not on tenterhooks for too long. I'll be back really soon with another episode, so until then, thank you so much. And look, a lot of the times in these episodes, we get a few tips and bits of advice for things we can try out, which might seem like they're not something we can do straight away. You can do something straight away. Next time you talk to anyone, even vaguely, about something where you don't think they're going to agree with you, think about how you're having that conversation. Try and have it in a slightly different way. Don't go in there with any sort of sense of an agenda. Just ask people what they think and listen and have a chat. And you never know, you might get somewhere. Okay, bye.